Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'm going to be sharing Bigfoot stories. Let's get into it. Story 1. Having lived in the area for more than 4 years, I'd become accustomed to and familiar with driving my ATV, a Honda 450 Foreman, in and around the Daniel Boone National Forest. I was 22 years old and was dating a local girl who had lived in the county her whole life. We'll call her Pam. We left my house on October one night, traveled to the end of my ridge road, which is gravel, then continued on the dirt logging road, no longer in use at the time, which is privately owned. This road, of course, was wide enough to have at one time accommodated trucks and machinery used for logging. This old road goes on for maybe a mile to a mile and a half eastward before splitting into 3 separate roads, each having several arteries branching from them. We stayed on the eastward path that runs into Daniel Boone National Forest. From this point there is an old horse trail that the locals use for their equine excursions. We had traveled the entire horse trail and all the logging roads many times, and I felt intimately familiar with every nook and cranny these paths offered. Pam and I motored down the horse trail at leisurely pace, due to the narrowness of the trail among the thick forest trees. This, coupled with the many twists and turns of the horse trail, one could rarely exceed 8 to 10 miles per hour. I know this because the ATV had a digital mile per hour readout that was backlit for night travel. After 200-300 yards, we came upon a small pond that sits on the south side of the trail. This was a favorite spot of mine. Many times I would travel to this spot at night, turn off my lights and engine, and just sit and gaze at the stars and take in all the smells and sounds this forest offers. I saw my first shooting star while gazing up into the fall sky the year before in this very spot. The small circular pond sits in a very tiny clearing of the forest just off the trail, with the tree line only about 20 feet from the water's edge all the way around. I pulled around to the side of the pond opposite the trail. Under a clear, half-moonlit sky, I turned off the engine and lights. I was oblivious that we had just parked near an entity that did not want us there. Fortunately, before we could even lift our butts off the seat to get out the ATV, there was a tremendous roar that came from the tree line directly behind us, and probably no more than 40-50 yards away. I was instantly terrified at this. It was a sound I never heard before. It was loud and near. Pam screamed and I started up the ATV and headed back down the trail toward home. Luckily, the trail back out of there lay right in front of us. Holding on to me from behind, Pam remained silent as we made our escape. As quickly as I could, and without hitting any trees, we made our way back to the logging road a few hundred yards away. I never remembered turning my body to look back, but I looked from side to side many times. This model ATV has 3 headlights. 2 are in a fixed position on the four-wheeler's front, and a third is attached to the handlebars, and thus turned from side to side several dozen times as we made our way back to the logging road. From the pond to the logging road, I saw nothing unusual on either side of the tree line, neither directly nor in my peripheral. But remember, the horse trail is on forest property, and the trees are much more densely populated. Even with the ATV's lights and the half moon, my vision would have been severely limited. Neither of us shouted or spoke to one another during the retreat on the horse trail. During this time, I remember telling myself over and over that it must be some kind of animal or even a bird that had made that awful noise. Finally, after what had seemed like an eternity, we reached the logging road. It greeted us with a straighter, wider path that sparsely populated trees. Now comes the recollection that haunts my dreams to this day. Having reached the logging road without seeing or hearing any signs that we were being pursued, and not wanting to wreck, of course, I only moderately quickened our pace. Now, on the south side of the trail, something caught my eyes. I saw a dark figure running parallel to the road directly to my left about 30 yards. This thing was running on 2 legs. It looked like a very tall and large human form. I looked directly at it for a few seconds, turned back to look at the road, then turned and looked in its direction once more to discover it was still there, keeping pace with us. During the second and final glance at this being, which also just lasted a couple of seconds, It was one of these moments in life you wonder if what you're experiencing is real or just a dream. I looked down at my large digital backlit speedometer, 22 miles per hour. Finally, a moderately sharp bend to the south in the trail, I had to slow a little. As the road straightened again, I floored it, and for the first time turned my body to look to the left and a little behind to see if this curve to the left had allowed the creature an advantage, in case it was upon me or even in front of me. Nothing. It was not in close proximity to the left or rear. I even scanned the trees to my right. Nothing. I cocked my head to the side and yelled over the sound of the engine. "Pam, did you see it?" These being the first words we had spoken since the encounter. She must have thought my abrupt acceleration was due to the fact that beyond the sharp turn in the trail we just passed, the road did become more straight and smooth. Her response in my ear was, "I didn't see anything. Did you see something?" I said, "Nope," with intentions of telling her everything once we reached my house. I slowed my pace, and within minutes we were on the gravel road which led home. We went over the experience again and again that night, but I never told her what I saw. I sold my four-wheeler and moved to the city in the summer of 1999. I purchased another ATV in 2000. I bought a trailer and would pull my ATV to the 49 exit off I-75 and do my riding in Laurel and Rockcastle counties. I hauled my ATV back to the area I saw the creature on a summer day in 2001. I was alone. It went to the pond and stood on the bank for a few minutes. I skipped a few rocks and left. It was a beautiful day. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. The male witness was sitting on his porch around 10:30 p.m. when he heard something coming from his apple trees. As he listened, it sounded like kids climbing in the branches. He hollered and heard what sounded like whoever it was must have jumped from the tree, landed on the ground and walking off. Not thinking much about it, he went inside his home. A little later, his dog became quite agitated and started growling and barking while looking out the glass patio sliding door. The man was watching television. He got up to see what his dog was so angry about, and he looked out the patio door. What he saw was quite remarkable. He saw the silhouette of a black ape-looking creature that had what he described as a head sitting on its shoulders with no neck. It appeared to be 7 to 8 foot tall. It stood motionless and stared at the man down before it turned around and melted into the darkness. The man who saw it called law enforcement, and they contacted me. There is one thing I did not find out until I did a follow-up interview. When the man heard his dog barking, he walked outside and he saw the creature. It was about 30 feet away. When he looked back toward his house, then looked back again, the creature charged. Now it was only about 20 feet away. Then it took off. He saw it again about 3 nights ago walking the field next to his house, and it was moving very quickly. Several people in the area have also seen it. This is just a short distance from my home as the crow flies, maybe 3 miles. This person informed me that while he was sassafras hunting and he found what appeared to be a nesting area on the ground that was several feet across and had been constructed of branches, twigs, and other debris. In the nest was different clumps of matted hair and fur. When he took his brother to the area a few days later, the nest was completely destroyed and the hair and fur was gone. Has anyone else ever heard of anything like this happen before? Story 3. We used to live in Baileyville, Maine, but just moved to Millinocket. We thought you would like to know this story. We had dinner over Thanksgiving in 2006 with a group of 60 or more friends and relatives who lived over by Medibemps, Maine. This happened in Washington County, Maine. There was this couple down the long Thanksgiving table from us from Woodland Junction, Maine, who had driven down with their elderly mother and their aunt, her sister, both widows with some standing in their respective communities over there on the Indian Township Reservation. This is about all I know of them. I don't know what started the conversation as I got in on it after it started. Everyone was eating, the table grew quiet, and I heard this word used that got my attention. Betty Bemp's howler. The two older ladies, we never got their names, too many people, were telling about when they were little girls. They went with their parents over there to Betty Bemp's lake to fish for smallmouth bass. Evidently, the family went often. They said they were poor, didn't have fancy camp gear, slept under the stars, unafraid with their parents and uncle. They went on recalling how those were the days, and said as young girls had a favorite rocky island in the lake where they thought the fishing was best, and sometimes they would sleep at this little place in order to get first light fishing real early. Except when this howler thing started calling across the lake, then it happened either the uncle or the father would canoe out to collect them from the rocky outcrop. They explained the howling was more like a monotonous singing from someone with a husky voice, but it was called a howler. They said that for a long time they didn't know what the howler was, and that as children they just went there where they were told, until one day they were left alone on that rock island, and the adults went out quite a distance onto the lake to fish another area. The one lady remembers they had 2 biscuits left from breakfast, some worms and crickets to fish with until the mid-late afternoon. The older of the two little older ladies interrupted the other one to tell about when the howlers started singing again. Anxious for their parents to return, she said the two tied up the 3 smallmouth bass on a market string, placed them in a bucket of water, then waited and worried. The howling grew louder, and then she said it got quiet all of a sudden. The two girls looked around behind them, and there stood 2 giant Indians dripping wet. She said the giants stared down at the two of them and then reached over and took their catch. The bigger one walked over to the smaller giant and handed the fish to that one. The lady telling the story was gesturing with her hands. Then the black giants went into the water and swam away with the fish. This man sitting across the table from them, the 2 Indian ladies, asked how big the giants were, and they said 2 fathers high. The one lady said the 2 fathers high giants were covered in black shiny hair, and both giants were dripping wet and had huge hairy black hands with fingers as big as the fish they caught. They had big feet and had no clothing. At that recollection, the 2 ladies covered their mouth and sniggered. When the parents finally came in the canoe to pick the girls up, they were not very surprised at their story and told them that the Betty Bemp's howler, who was known to steal fish and sometimes little girls, had visited them. After that, the girls were left at the campground area and never fished alone again. In fact, the one lady said they never went back to their favorite rock island to fish again. The description seemed close enough to Bigfoot to tell people about it. If there were other reports from the area that anyone knows about, I'd like to know. Story 4. A friend and I, he's a zoology student, decided to spend a part of our vacation walking the Bemis Valley Trail. It's a tough climb for those of us not used to frequent alpine climbs. Roughly like 12 to 15 mile loop through rugged country. The 4 peaks of the Bemis are breathtakingly beautiful in the autumn. We took a side trail down to Moose Look Maguntic Lake and arrived in time to watch the sun going down. We tacked down a 2-man tent, and as we talked about turning in early, exhausted from the day's hike, we heard movement, then saw a huge man-shaped shadow approaching the water's edge of the lake. I asked Jim who he thought it was. We hadn't seen any other hikers around, and this thing was huge. We stared briefly, then he grabbed my hand. "Get in the tent," he said. "Why? What is that?" He shushed me to be very quiet, and we watched, being very still. The dark figure waded into the water and stood very still for the longest time. Then suddenly, like a shot, it took a header with its arms down by its sides, head first into the lake. It was a huge splash. The ripples faded along with the last rays of daylight, and yet we kept staring into the darkening lake with wonder. How truly bizarre. I'm not used to seeing anything like that. I'm a city girl. Jim, however, was raised in the country, is nature savvy, and seemed floored at what we just witnessed. I asked him if that could have been a big bear. He answered with a resounding, "No, that was no bear. It was no moose. It was the biggest man I've ever seen, or it was Bigfoot, but too dark to see details." I laughed and said there's no such thing. I read about that man out in the West somewhere that made up that story, but Jim insisted they do exist. We had just seen one dive into Moose Look McGuntic. He must have been right, because who would dive into that black as pitch lake at night? If it ever surfaced, we didn't see it. He got chills and started to shiver. He went quiet for a while, then said, "I wonder if you realize how rare what we just saw is." I didn't know what to say, but in my mind I thought he really thinks that thing was Bigfoot. He continued to shiver from exhaustion and probably excitement. As tired as we were that night, we didn't sleep much until almost dawn. Jim seemed awed by it. I didn't know what to think. We slept in until almost noon Sunday. We went down to the water's edge where this thing was last seen. There was one clear half-barefoot print in the mud, pointing toward the water. The heel to the little toe showed, and Jim figured to be about 14-15 inches long, but longer at the big toe's end. The heel width was about 6 inches, but we had nothing to measure accurately but our hands and a flashlight. Neither of us could ascertain or be certain about the length, since the big toe and the second toe were under water and muddied. The heel depth was at least 3.5 inches deep. Jim was very quiet and reflective on the trek home, and preoccupied. During the drive he told me nobody would ever believe us. We ought to just stay quiet about the incident last night. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.